Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Stephanie Bree, and this is a first in I won't say ongoing series, but there will be at least 12 episodes planned. And there'll be one every, I don't know if it'll be once a week or twice a week or one a month. I don't know how often I'll do these. Uh, but this is Console Wars retrospective, where I'll break apart individual respective console wars and talk about them from my perspective as well as my knowledge base, what I know about them. These are not going to be the so-called Wikipedia console generations. These are going to be grouped a little bit differently, but they should still be familiar to either the people who were there or the people who have researched them through YouTube, etc. There's a bajillion YouTube videos on, the 16-bit era, so that video is probably going to be fairly repetitive, I believe. But let's start off with the Atari era. Now, the Atari era includes everything from Pong all the way up to the NES. And I call it the Atari era, even though it's technically 8-bit consoles, but it's also pre-8-bit consoles, which is hard to explain to people. So this includes the Pong systems, the Magnavox Odyssey, the Channel F, the Odyssey 2, the Atari 2600, 5200, 7800, the Mattel Intellivision, and the ColecoVision. Now, there are other consoles and console-like systems and home computers and things in there, but some of those are going to get their own episodes separate from this, and some of those, let's be real, are insignificant enough that they don't really deserve talking about. Like the XEGS. I'm not going to waste my breath talking about it because it literally doesn't fucking matter in the grand scheme of things. So, this is not a documentary video. If you watched any of my videos, this is mostly just me rambling. So, this is not a first source. You can reference this video if you're doing research for like a theme or a paper or something. It's mostly just my musings and observations from what I know about the era. I was born in 82. My first home console was a Coleco Gemini, which was a Atari 2600 clone that was manufactured by Coleco. And so it was essentially, for all intents and purposes, an Atari 2600. Because it just played Atari 2600 games. So those were the video games I started with. But I had a friend who had an Odyssey 2. I had a friend who had a 7800. I had another friend who had a 5200. I was familiar with the Intellivision and the ColecoVision because they were in stores. And, I read about them years later. I have had an Intellivision at one point in my life. I have never had a ColecoVision. It's one of the few game consoles I've never owned. But, so, I'm not going to get into the history of the development of video games, I'm not going to talk about Nolan Bushnell or Ralph Baer or any of that shit. Or the rise of Atari and none of that. I'm just going to talk about the systems and what I know about them. So, the first video game consoles were all Pongs. And yes, I know technically the Magnavox Odyssey is not called Pong, as are most of the consoles from this period weren't called Pong either, because that was Atari's trademark. It is literally a Pong. It's what it is. It is not trademark Pong, but it's a Pong. And we're saying Pong here like we say Kleenex to refer to tissues. But not all tissues are Kleenex, but we just say Kleenex instead of tissues anyways. So when I say Pong was the very first game console ever released, I mean it was. I'm not saying Atari Pong was the first game console ever released, but the first game console that was ever released was a Pong system, even though it wasn't called Pong. So let's get that out of the way, all right? Because I will be saying video games start with Pong. And I don't need dipshits talking about fucking Tennis for Two or Space War, what the fuck ever. Because those were never released as home consoles. So, don't even fucking come at me. So, your first wave of video game consoles were all standalone plug-and-play TV machines that were just variations of Pong. That's all they were. The first home console that had interchangeable cartridges was still essentially a Pong system. It was a little bit more advanced, but it was still, very primitive. And it was the Fairchild Channel F. This is another one that the history of it is kind of fuzzy because there was some shenanigans. But we don't need to get into that. There are whole documentaries on it. Go watch those documentaries and get it from them. And the next one, I believe, was the either the Odyssey 2 or the Atari 2600. And I don't know which one came out first, but they came out, I believe, around the same time. So I'm going to say probably the same year, essentially, or close enough to say that the Odyssey 2, and the 2600 are more or less the same console. There are differences, but they have basically the same library. What I mean by that is video game design was so primitive at the time that there was literally just the racing game, the football game, the space shooter game, the asteroid shooting game, etc. They all had different names on different consoles, but it was the same fucking game over and over and over again. There wasn't a lot of variety in the software libraries from one console to the next. So the games on the 2600 are the same games with just different names that are on the Magnavox Odyssey 2 as the same games that are on the next one, the Intellivision, and the next one, the ColecoVision, and then also the Atari 5200. Now, the Intellivision, I believe, came out in 1979, so it was a couple of 2 or 3 years after the Odyssey 2 and the 2600, so it was a little bit more advanced. Noticeable at the time, but by today's standards, gamers look at it, and you might be able to point to an Intellivision game and say, oh, I guess that's better graphics. I guess. But it's not like impactfully noticeable better. It's like, yeah, okay, technically better, but like in the grand scheme of things, not really. It's more or less the same. Kind of like the difference between the Xbox 360 and the PS3. The PS3 is technically more powerful than the Xbox 360, but in practical terms, they're identical. More or less. And this is the same way. Technically, the Intellivision is technically more powerful than the 2600, but in terms of practical reality, you really can't fucking tell one from another. They're not like, oh my god, this is so much better, obviously better. Like, only slightly better and not even enough to really fucking make a difference at this point in time. The 5200 and the ColecoVision came out in 82, and they were the next generation of hardware, but not technically the next generation in the sales market, which is, again, why this gets confusing. Because the Dreamcast is an example, I'll use that as an example, competed with the PlayStation 1 and the N64 and the Sega Saturn even though it was technically the replacement to the Sega Saturn, it was lumped in that same generation. It is not in the generation with the PS2, GameCube, and Xbox. Those are the next generation. The 5200 is noticeably more advanced than the Intellivision and the Odyssey 2 and the 2600 in that it has more detailed graphics, more colors, better sounds, and it can have more advanced gameplay. So you can it is observably different. Like to the point where you can point to the 5200 version of a game and you can tell it's the 5200 version of a game. Whereas if you see the Intellivision version side by side with the 2600 version, unless someone points it out to you, you could get confused which is which. Because the 2600 outlived all of these consoles. And so it got progressively more advanced as programmers figured out ways to, push the hardware to its limits, as is often the case when a console keeps going after its successors have come and gone. Again, like the example of the PS2, they were still making PS2 right before they launched the PS4. So, you know what I'm saying? This stuff gets muddy, which is why I don't like using the Wikipedia console generations, because it gets too confusing and Wikipedia is inconsistent in how it lumps them together. And so, yeah. Anyways, putting that aside, what's noticeable about this generation is it's all brand new. There is no template for how to design a video game console. There is no path to victory. There is no, there's no market to speak of, so there's no franchises yet. So everything is just trial and error. Everyone's literally just trying to figure it out. So you get a lot of... So basically, at this time, you get a lot of experimentation. Now, it's worth noting also back then, separate from the home video game console market, you had the arcade market, and then you had the home computer market. Now, the way those relate to home consoles is a little bit different than today. Back then, by and large, the trend was you created a video game for the arcades, and if it was popular enough, you would port it to home consoles and home computers. Now, that's not to say some games didn't originate on PCs or home computers at the time, and some games were made exclusively for home consoles, because they were. There were games that were made for specific home consoles that never got ported to anything else, many of which are still stuck in the past. And there were games created for home computers at the time that were either, we'll say, clones of the arcade or console game that was popular at the time, or they were uniquely original conceptions designed to take advantage of the unique hardware on that respective computer at the time, which is, again, where things get a little muddy. We don't have a centralized market like we do today, where we basically have the dominant operating system, Windows, and the dominant digital storefront, Steam, and then a handful of competitors. Back then, everything was just fractured as all hell. Every computer manufacturer basically had their own operating system and their own hardware and their own graphics card specifications and their own CPU technology, etc. So everything was more specialized back then. So if you were a programmer that made computer games for Atari computers, you most likely didn't port them to Commodore or Apple or IBM or other computers. You just produced games for Atari computers because that was what you were familiar with. Likewise, home computer games games that were designed for computers did not translate well to home consoles because, one, they wouldn't have as much RAM and hard drive space as the home computer would. They wouldn't have floppy drives, typically. Now, there are exceptions, but typically they wouldn't have keyboards, which would be necessary for some of these computer games. And they wouldn't have tape drives or expansion slots or graphics cards, etc. So these games could not easily be ported to home computers in a recognizable state. It's not to say they didn't try if a game was popular enough. Like the big example is Ghostbusters, which did exist on the Commodore 64, the Nintendo Entertainment System, the Sega Master System, and yes, the Atari 2600, because like I said, they were still selling Atari 2600s at that time, and there was still a market for it. So, yeah. The big winner, the winner of the console war of this time period, of the Atari era was Atari. And not just because the dominant console of the time was the 2600, but also because Atari had a successful arcade business. They had a successful home computer business with their 8-bit and their ST line. They had a semi-successful, they had a successful restaurant spinoff, Chuck E. Cheese. They were doing well at the time, better than everybody else, and they outlasted everybody else. Not to say that they lasted indefinitely, just they lasted longer than everyone else of the time. Atari is also the winner of the console war because even though they did have a successor to the 2600, first was the 5200 Super System and then the 7800 Pro System. The Super System being in between the pre-8-bit era and the NES Master System 8-bit era, and the 7800 being more or less on par with the NES and the Master System. And I say more or less. It was in the same hardware category as them, but it is absolutely the weaker of the three. Yeah. Now, to say Atari won the generation is, I believe, accurate, but it's worth noting technically nobody won that generation because everybody who was making games back then, everybody, has gone out of business since then. All of them. They're all gone. Now, Mattel still exists as a company, but they sold off the Intellivision rights. Coleco went out of business. Atari went out of business, and their intellectual property has been auctioned off multiple times since then, but the company doesn't exist anymore. Magnavox, I don't know if they still exist anymore, but they're not making video game stuff anymore if they do still exist. And that's pretty much it. Even the third-party companies at the time who were making games, some of them are still around, but most of them are gone. And the computer companies who were around back then, Commodore and Tandy and, some of the others, I can't name them all, they're gone. Apple is still around, but Windows and DOS are still around, but the companies that were manufacturing computers that ran Windows and DOS at the time are not still around for the most part. They're all gone. So, technically, nobody won the Atari era, pre-8-bit era generation. Nobody. Because they all went out of business. This is what eventually led to the infamous video game crash, which was what led into the release of the Nintendo Entertainment System a couple years later that would breathe new life into the fractured video game business and lay the foundation for the business as we know it today. But that's another video for another day. So let's talk about some highlights. Everything pre 2600 or VCS, Video Computer System, as it was originally called, is more or less a variation of Pong. A lot of arcade games at the time were just variations of Pong too. Breakout was a single player Pong, is what it was designed to be. So, some of the big games that stuck around. And I'm just going to name the games, not necessarily which system they were on, unless they were very specific to one console, and I can confirm that they were only on that one console. Excuse me. So, some notable games from the time would be Haunted House on the Atari 2600, Frogger, which was an arcade game that got ported to multiple systems, Pac-Man, which is infamous because the Atari 2600 port is notoriously awful, and but the game itself was ported to everything at the time, as it continues to be today because it's a popular game. Other ones would be Asteroids. Asteroids is notable because the arcade game utilized vector graphics, but the VCS was not capable of vector graphics, so it was converted to sprite-based graphics. And, well, I shouldn't say sprite-based because they weren't really sprites yet. But anyways, 2D graphics, I'll say. And, the Atari VCS port of Asteroids is a completely different game from the arcade port. It isn't just a port, it's a whole different game with the same name. And then there's other games like Space Invaders was big, Defender was big, Donkey Kong was big, Mario Brothers was big. Those games would help, establish Nintendo as a presence in the video game business, among others. And then there were other games like Berserk was really popular, Wizard of War was a big one, Tapper, which was originally called, I think it was just called Tapper, and then it was changed to Root Beer Tapper, because in the arcade it was a beer game, but then it was changed to Root Beer. And then there's other games like Tempest is another one. Joust is a big one from the time. And then Pitfall, which is unique because Pitfall helped not only help lay the foundation for the 2D side-scrolling platformer action-adventure type game, it was also created by Activision, which was made up of former Atari employees who left Atari to create their own company over, royalty disputes and credit and things like that. Activision was well known in the Atari era for being creating the best games of the time. Frankly, they were the alternative to Atari's first party games. Now I could sit here and talk about the games all day long, but the next thing I want to talk about that is very different from one system to the next is the controllers, because the Atari era, again, is unique in that, again, because the video games are extremely primitive by today's standards, the controllers are reflective of that. So the Pong systems all just use paddle controls, or some variation of paddle controls. And most of your consoles, the Ataris, the Intellivision, the Odyssey 2, the 7800, the 5200, the ColecoVision, most of them used a joystick with a handful of buttons. one or two buttons, action buttons, and then some of them had number pads on them, and one of them, the Odyssey 2, had a membrane keyboard built into the system, so you had access to a keyboard for some games. This was interesting because while the games are relatively primitive by today's standards, because these controllers were so unique, some games which do utilize the controllers are actually not advanced in, like, say, graphics or, presentation or sound or, whatever, but are really advanced in terms of gameplay, or complex, I should say, in terms of gameplay, which makes some of them extremely difficult to play off native hardware. This is why Intellivision emulation isn't really a thing, because the Intellivision controller is so specific to the Intellivision console, and the games that utilize the controller do so in such a very specific way, it cannot be easily emulated or replicated on modern hardware. I say easily. It can be done, but it isn't accurate to what was essentially the experience you had at the time. So Intellivision, ColecoVision emulation is very imperfect. Now, Atari 2600 is a joystick that has 8 directions and 1 button. However, the Atari also had switches on the console, and the gameplay could depend on which controller port the joystick was plugged into, and as well as the order you flipped the switches. So games could be more complex than just a single button. And because there were really no instruction books back then, some games had instruction books, but there were no on-screen instructions, and instruction books usually found their way into the trash bin. Some of these games are extremely difficult to play if you don't know what you're doing, because they're very cryptic and they don't give you any answers on how to play them. Sometimes how even to start the game can be difficult. So even though it's technically primitive by today's standards, in a lot of ways, the early Atari era games are actually more complex than modern games, in that it's fucking difficult to figure out how to play them. Especially the ones whereas there's no modern documentation, or there's no analogous modern controller that can replicate its controls accurately, so you're still kind of fiddling around. So a lot of these games, by today's standards, are unplayable unless you're playing them on literal, original physical hardware. Or, fairly accurate retro clones, which is another topic for another day. Needless to say, the Atari era was also known for having a lot of variety. There were so many players in the Atari era. So much innovation and trial and error and competition. It's not like today where we have 3 companies that rule the world. Back then, everybody could design a game console, get it on store shelves, get games made for it, go out of business, and then it would be forgotten 6 years later. But obviously things have changed since then. It's a lot harder to get a game console made today because it's more expensive, because they're more advanced, as well as the games cost a tremendously more amount of money to create, which means the barrier of entry is incredibly high. So you have to have a high chance of success in order to recoup your costs, and it just isn't worth it for outside players to try to break into the firmly established market that we have today, that has been relatively unchanged since the year 2000. This is 2024 almost. So for 24 years, there has been little change in the market of the video game industry, at least in terms of home consoles, which is what we're talking about here. This is why the series is called Console Wars, not Video Game Wars. Now, I'm going to pick one game from the period that is unique to the period, that is not a part of a franchise, that is not, infamous like E.T. or Pac-Man for whatever reason. I have one game in particular I want to briefly talk about before I wrap this up, which to me I think defines this era. And it's by Activision, and it's called Demon Attack. Demon Attack, for lack of a better descriptor, is more or less a kind of Space Invaders clone, kind of Galaga Galaxian clone. But of all the different clones of those games, including the originals, Space Invaders, Galaga, etc., Demon Attack is, in my opinion, the best of them all. And it's unfortunate that there hasn't been a franchise built off of this property, because they definitely could have done a lot more with it than they did. Thanks for watching. More videos to come.